Advanced TV Herstory, the podcast that brings you fresh perspective on the importance of TV in our lives. We tell stories of leadership, persistence, and achievement of TV women, because in the lives of women, no other media platform has influenced or inspired so many. Lo, these 60 years. Women of all ages have been impacted by what they've seen and will see on TV. So join us for a little advanced TV herstory by streaming it directly on our website, tvherstory.com, or anywhere you find podcasts. I'm your host, Cynthia Bemis Abrams. Hey, loyal listeners. You may recall that slowly but surely we're working our way through themes about TV's single women. These are lead characters of dramas and sitcoms, and it goes back all the way, 60 years. Women who are single. Single as in not married for the majority of the show's run. Single as in never married, or perhaps single as in divorced or widowed. In other episodes of Advanced TV Herstory, we talk about single woman themes with Jeanine Furino, who is the author of the book All the Single Girls. Last year, she wrote literally the compendium of all these series, the years that they ran, the time slots they occupied, the primary performers, general plot descriptions, fun tidbits. Yes, going back 60 years. Oh my gosh, what a project. From where I sit, it was in fact a project. I admire it. I admire it. But Jeanine and I have discussed at a higher level, or at a more detailed level, at an advanced level, as it were, listeners, the book's importance as a one-stop look back of how society viewed and valued single women. So feel free to go back to previous episodes of Advanced TV Herstory, like TV's Single Woman, the Feminist, TV's Single Woman Who Doesn't Know What She Wants, or just simply TV's Single Women, to hear more about the book and Furino's transition from being a super fan to a researcher to an author, because that in and of itself is a fascinating insight into how people take their passion and live it. The other cool thing that Jeanine did, however, is that she identified themes, because once you look at all that data, once you roll around in all those TV series titles and understand their descriptions, you find that there's only so many ways to tell a story. And so she named those themes, and some of them appear in our past titles, like the words feminist, the woman who doesn't know what she wants, and today's theme, the caregiver. This category, the caregiver, is actually rather short compared to others, and it is frankly weighted more in shows from the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And that's just in pure context to the women's movement and the kinds of stories that women voiced they wanted to see on TV. Having a woman caregiver as a major character does set some assumptions in place. Because with women caregivers, a caregiver versus, you have Benson out there as one example, and we'll talk a little bit about Benson. And then you have like butlers like Mr. Belvedere, which I never did watch. But with women caregivers, there are more likely to be kids and perhaps placed in a household that is incomplete due to the absence of a wife or mother. If there is a woman, a wife in the mix, and a caregiver, a maid, a housekeeper, a nanny, whatever, then you just have even, more opportunities, I guess, for conflict. But wow, I mean, it's not exactly real life. All right, so back to the caregivers that Jeanine Furino noted in her book, and they're the obvious ones, the ones that come to mind, like the nanny, starring Fran Drescher, and Florence, who is played by the incomparable Marla Gibbs in Norman Lear's classic The Jeffersons. And if you thought Alice, who was the Brady's housekeeper, if you liked her, if you thought she was the best part of the Brady Bunch, then throw her in the mix as well. This is not a test, people. This is fill out your best understanding and your most memorable characters, and then think more about how those women were depicted and how they factored into the dynamic even of the family. Or you have from 1999 to 2005, not a sitcom, but rather a drama, Judging Amy, which brought us two single women characters, Amy as a working single mother, which is another one of Furino's categories, but then also her mother, Maxine, played by, again, the incomparable Tyne Daly. And Maxine is a widowed woman, still with a strong professional background, a strong character in this, and is also charged with helping Amy run her household. A modern-day caregiver, as it were. Or, listeners, go back all the way to those great American days of black and white and early color classics, being facetious here, like Hazel. Okay, now Hazel starred the stage and screen veteran Shirley Booth, and Hazel was the Baxter family's live-in maid from 1961 to 1966. Now, here's a little fun fact that I like to throw in. Hazel's primary advertiser was Ford Motors, and in 1964, Hazel's audience was treated to the first TV invitations to drive a Ford Mustang. I just had to throw that in there because the Mustang. Don't get me going. But alas, during Hazel's run, and this is where we start putting, visualize in your head a timeline. And we have the timeline, which is the women's movement, which is, got its start really in the early 70s. And then hit the sort of troubled 80s, I guess it was. But the shoulder pads came along. Now, so the women's movement of the 70s, the civil rights movement of the 60s, the turbulence and the social change that the Vietnam War brought to bear on American culture. So during Hazel's run, that 1961 to 1966 period, which you saw that girl come on board, Hillary Clinton and Jessica Lange, they were entering their later teen years, their mid-late teen years. And the civil rights movement and technology and the economy was changing American life from the start, from 1961 to 1966. Tremendous social change. However, listeners, dial your time machine back another 10 years, and you get the first TV series named for a black woman. Beulah. Have you ever heard of Beulah? From 1952 to 1954, Beulah aired on TV, on ABC to be exact. Beulah actually got her start as a CBS radio show from the 40s, and it morphed over to TV when a lot of other radio shows were doing that. And Betty White was definitely a part of that transition, both on the front side and the back side. So she was not just a talent, but she was also an instigator of sorts. But Beulah was queen of the kitchen. That was kind of the carryover of that character. And she was the Henderson family's black maid, whose life included the family. There were family scenes and vignettes, as well as neighborhood characters, to make it just full and fulfilling and, the Lake Wobegon of the 40s and 50s. In its relatively short run, however, Beulah was played by three renowned black women. There were health issues. There were all sorts of performance issues that they could not keep a single woman in this position. And that story alone, listeners, is worth a future episode of Advanced TV Herstory, because these were really solid, legendary women with strong backgrounds. The Beulah role, however, had its own drama. But to know that Beulah ran in the early 50s and that Hazel followed 10 years later into the 60s is to prepare your media brain and that timeline in your head for the trope that premiered in 1981, and that is the series called Gimme a Break. Now, Gimme a Break is filled with as many social and what were they thinking questions as I have ever found in researching TV women. And I hit that question quite a bit. What were they thinking? Its premise is a little bit more classic late 60s Disney kids movie that we used to get our $2 and go down to the movie theater to get into the air conditioning and out of my mom's hair. And, it's that notion that there are no parents around, that it's only fun people taking care of kids and a certain suspension of reality. So in Gimme a Break, a white police chief's wife dies, leaving him with 3 kids. and her longtime friend, Nell, a single Black woman, moves in to raise those kids, to help with the household. Okay, listeners, this is 1981 we're talking about. TV was breaking new ground every week. Cable was opening up opportunities for fresh programming, reruns, old movies. I mean, this was beyond just network TV. There was a lot going on in 1981. And it's where many of us, yes, would also find the opportunity to while away hours before the internet happened, falling in love with classic TV and movies and garnering that stronger understanding of how society has changed. But we were kind of thinking that society had changed, that if there were Black servants in TV series from the 50s, well, that was the 50s, and that was 30 years ago. Or from movies from the 40s. It just felt like we were making progress, not regressing. Gimme a Break starred Nell Carter and ran for 6 seasons. Those seasons prompted a lot of discussion and questioning, that whole notion of progress, and forced morphing and tweaking that makes the work that was done behind a different world seem almost transactional. This is a series, Gimme a Break is a series that requires someone with more perspective than I to fully explain and explore with you. And I was fortunate to find such a person in Jennifer Fuller, who is a professor of media representation in society and other media topics at Miami University of Ohio. And I will tell you folks, she is simply awesome. Dr. Fuller researches and teaches using the social lens that helps us see the role that media plays in documenting history and leading social change. Very, very close to the kind of work and the topics that we seek out here on Advanced TV Herstory. While Gimme a Break as a series really did neither, it didn't document history and it didn't lead social change, it sort of did document the public discussion and the rejection of the traditional Black woman, maid, housekeeper, caregiver trope. And that's what makes this so important. Audio quality, however, is something that we strive for here at the podcast. And so when I reviewed Dr. Fuller's interview and found that the entire file had issues, I was faced with a question. I paused. Do I ask for a do-over? It was a really great interview. Do we run the whole thing as it is? No, I can't do that to you. So instead, I've carved out the smartest insights that she offered me for you, and I've just placed it into more context. It's a really great topic, and I'm grateful for her voice, because this voice and perspective that you'll hear on the topic of Black representation and the situation that Nell Carter was placed in, this is something that Dr. Fuller is best suited to describe. Like you and me, she started her research long before she even knew she was doing it. She was living it as a regular TV viewer, as a fan, as a teenager, benefiting from real-time conversation.
So you're right. That show was on television when I was a kid, and I remember liking the show, but I remember that my father really disliked it. And he really disliked it because it reminded him so much of traditional, stereotypical representations of Black people in film and television. And in fact, when I was growing up, whenever he would see something on television that he took issue with, he would talk to us about it. So I always grew up with this critical dialogue about media and race.
Gimme a Break starred Nell Carter, playing Nell Harper. Other shows premiering in 1981, hey, what was coming on at that time? Hill Street Blues, Falcon Crest, People's Court, The Smurfs, and Harper Valley PTA. Those were mostly white casts, and those were mostly premises of white society. It would be known as the heyday of quality television, however, just minutes before cable and VCRs totally changed our viewing habits forever. And some networks were more strategic than others about handling that and handling the growing sense that progress and representation mattered, as Dr. Fuller points out.
What has to happen then, you're going to have this And the fact that she's overweight as well is a huge issue. So you're going to have this overweight Black woman taking care of a white family. Then, what do you do? How do you grapple with the fact that in many ways she ticks the boxes for the mammy stereotype? Well, what the show did a few things. When the show first appeared and publicity for the show first circulated, she was a maid, right? They talked about her as a maid. The publicity photograph had the man of the house, Carl Kaniski, seated, and she was standing pouring coffee into his cup, and the cup was overflowing with coffee. So that being the comedic promise of the show, right? That this maid who was perhaps inept and or sassy working for this white guy.
In 1980, when this series was probably getting discussed as a concept, we were 41 years past the premiere of Gone with the Wind. We were almost 30 years past Beulah and 15 past Hazel. Women were filling seats in college classrooms and at historic rates, and the deadline for passing the ERA through ratification in state legislatures was looming. And there on network TV was a modern-day mammy.
I wrote about it as, here are all the ways in which she fits the mammy stereotype, which is the traditional way that people have studied Give Me a Break and have studied the character Nell Harper. There wasn't a lot of research on the character in the show, but the little that existed was explaining how she fit all the characteristics of a mammy.
So without getting too meta on you, this is the moment TV Herstory is made, when a researcher begins questioning and documenting TV decisions about representation. It wasn't just that Nell Harper was originally depicted as a mammy, thereby exposing yet another generation to a servant-based relationship that was largely outdated, that otherwise would never have hit the middle class's middle American radar. We didn't think about mammies in 1981. That was black and white TV. That was the movies. That wasn't where we were going. It's what the show's producers and writers did well or poorly, intentionally or by accident, once they opened the door. That's most of the story behind this Gimme a Break topic. The story of Gimme a Break is as much how it changed as a series as it was the depiction of the single Black woman caregiver.
I just suspect that either they felt like the audience would see it as something wry and sort of everybody's in on the joke, or maybe they didn't think too much about how that representation might be troublesome. But it was, as soon as the show was being previewed, people were objecting to that representation. I really find it hard to consider that in 1981 that they would have pitched a show with this idea of her morphing. And the show lasted, the ratings were enough for it to limp along, but what starts to happen is that as NBC starts to get its footing with sitcoms, it gets further in trouble. So while it's on the air, we end up, we get 227, we get Golden Girls, and we get The Cosby Show. And when these shows start appearing, Gimme a Break looks even more out of date. So people thought it was out of date in 1980. Definitely by 85, it's considered to be way out of date. So I think what happened was if NBC hadn't been in such a precarious position with the ratings, the show probably would have been cut sooner.
Listeners, the full series is available on DVD, and in viewing the entire run, you too can see the subtle and bold steps taken season after season to bring Nell Harper into the 80s and make her more than a mammy. Nell's wardrobe changed. Nell herself lost a significant amount of weight, which was aided, no doubt, by a cocaine habit, a well-documented cocaine habit. It was the 80s, after all. Nell started having a life. Nell, the character, started having a life outside the home, as well as all the duties that she had inside it, managing the house and tending the police chief's kids.
And so as the show changes, she's portrayed as somebody who is striving, who wants better for herself, certainly as the older girls are growing up. Now, of course, she acquires 2 more young kids, which is part of trying to make sure the audience stays interested in this dynamic of her hanging out with young kids. So there was a lot of tension in there between maintaining this notion of Nell as somebody who takes care of young kids and this idea of she's changing, she's growing, she's becoming a professional woman. And one of the elements of the show that some people took, at least one person, I don't think she was the only person, took exception with, was that the lyrics of the opening credits said, "I finally know where I belong." And so if you portray her in 1981 as this maid in this white household, it's like the question is that where she belongs? But as the show shifts, you get this different notion of her wanting to sort of belong someplace else.
Actress Nell Carter was just 32 when Gimme a Break premiered. Prior to TV, she had worked in theater with no formal training before becoming the breakout star of Broadway's musical hit Ain't Misbehavin', and she garnered a Tony Award for that work in 1978 and later an Emmy for the TV version of Ain't Misbehavin'. Nell Carter in the early 80s was a big deal. And even in the late 70s, there wasn't that much else going on. So Broadway, trickling over to TV, that was culture. And she looked and she sounded in this one of a kind, big voice, small body sort of thing. And her story was the American dream story, that hard work and talent will be rewarded. Just sing your heart out and people are going to pay attention. However, in 1981, the situation she was put into, leading Gimme a Break, the lines that she was writing were not written by sisters. In fact, Gimme a Break was produced and directed by men, we can assume white men, and the women only made up about a quarter of the writing staff. So Nell Harper, the character, initially positioned as a mammy, was indeed given room to be more.
But when she was on stage in Ain't Misbehavin', her weight was part of her sex appeal, right? It was part of what made her the sassy blues woman. In the series itself, she owns her body and claims to be sexy. So, but that is also seen as, oh, ha, 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 that's so sassy. That's that sort of sassy blackness that's in the show, similar to Arnold Jackson, played by Gary Coleman in Different Strokes. His What You Talk About Willis as that kind of sassy blackness, or Benson's, sassy blackness with his sharp-tongued wit. Her sass was absolutely connected to her body in a way that both made her someone to be laughed at, but also this element that made her different and unique in this white environment.
Okay, I gotta say, I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall in the writer's room. Here, white people, we have the lead character, a black lady, who can't be depicted as a mammy, even though that's how we positioned her originally when we launched the show and it got accepted. Oh, and by the way, there are the kids that she takes care of. So start making her seem like she's something other than a mammy and a nanny and a housekeeper, because we don't really want to continue that trope, but don't make it seem as though she's being negligent to those duties or uncaring in any way. Yeah, I'm glad I wasn't a writer in that room. But that's sort of what they did. And they were actually quite successful because they kept the audience watching, and the show went on season after season. Nell went to school, and in doing so, she helped instill, I think, a sense of optimism about the future, her future. That still was a time where the number of families with college-educated kids in them was growing. Education was really big in the early 80s, throughout the 80s, as an accomplishment, as a life achievement, as a milestone. The writers dug their way out of that initial hole, that hole framing her as a mammy, and also brought forth an opportunity for, in fact, deeper discussion. And that is society's perpetuation or rejection of mammies and the traditional roles and occupations for Black women in the 70s and 80s, and the importance of education and pride in one's own accomplishments. How does that discussion happen? It's usually a two-way street. So enter Thelma Hopkins, who, listeners, you may recognize as a familiar face of TV sitcoms and one of the original backup singers of that great 70s band, Tony, Orlando, and Dawn. Hopkins's character, Addie, personifies the questions in fact raised by the show's original tone-deaf premise. That whole mammy, caregiver, Black woman heading the household sort of thing.
There's an episode where, a key episode in the series in terms of Nell's character is that a friend of hers from home visits her. And her friend, her name's Addie, who I mentioned as someone who became increasingly important character in the show. She was introduced in an episode in which she has come to visit her friend/rival, Nell, and she is a professor and she has a PhD and she is a member of Phi Beta Kappa. And when she meets Nell, Nell is not happy to see her. She's teasing Nell, and we get the sense that Addie has sort of always been beating Nell at these various kinds of ways in which they may have had this rivalry all along. And it's Addie makes this very condescending remark that says, after all the disappointments, you're happy here as a maid in a white household. And the audience just boos and hisses, and Nell gets really angry. Nell is clearly very hurt. And so she and Addie have another confrontation later in the episode. And she throws books down from her shelves and says, all these books I've read, and it doesn't mean anything to you. It doesn't matter. I've read this, I've read that, and I've read the other thing. And she told her, you came in here telling me I was a failure as a modern Black woman. I was a happy Black woman until you brought your modern Black butt in the house. And it's a very it's an incredibly powerful scene for her. There's also this element throughout the episode that the quote-unquote modern Black woman is like the people who have been criticizing the show the whole time. You're a maid for a white family. Isn't that pitiful? And Nell has to speak back and say, I'm happy in my role, that kind of thing. However, it's the very same episode in which she vows to go to night school.
Folks, bottom line is that there was a lot more to Give Me a Break than met the eye. Dr. Fuller mentioned 227 and The Cosby Show, Different Strokes, and Benson. These series are still being studied for their representation, good and bad. The messaging and the real-time adjustments that the series made that can be attributed to public criticism. The premise of Give Me a Break, however, rested squarely on the shoulders and the talent of Nell Carter. I wonder, whether Carter and Thelma Hopkins were able to influence dialogue and emphasis, and what made sense and what didn't make sense. I am due to spend more time talking with Dr. Fuller, whose class Media Representation and Society I'd love to sit in on. So listeners, if something's on your mind that you'd like to hear Dr. Fuller discuss in great depth, do send me a note by email or shout out on Twitter. I'll give you that information in just a minute. It just feels like she really has given this the depth. She's really taken a good look at some of these important, under-discussed series. Dr. Fuller joins a long list of smart, eloquent, and I mean eloquent, not just articulate professors who have shared their research and insight here on Advanced TV Herstory. We wouldn't be bringing you the quality today that we are without them taking their time and also just the research that they do. There are certainly many professors who I haven't had the chance to interview and would like to for all sorts of reasons it hasn't worked out. So I am grateful to every one of those who spend their hours preparing for the classroom, that they also bring their expertise to this virtual classroom. Dr. Fuller can be reached by email at fullerj@miamioh.edu. fullerj@miamioh.edu. And the book, That got us to this caregiver topic in the first place is Jeanine Furino's All the Single Girls, which is available on Amazon, and also look for the link in our show notes here. I can't produce a single episode these days without the great assistance of Jen Eads, audio technician and editor and producer, and Catherine Yang, who is our video producer, because we are now establishing more of a video platform for you and me to talk TV Herstory. Music you hear throughout these and all episodes is Jazzer's Take Me Higher, found on Free Music Archive. Talk to us on Twitter. Our handle is @TV Herstory. And if you're a little Twitter shy, or you've just decided to put that app away, then send us an email. Topics, sensitive or otherwise, are always welcome at advancedtvherstory@gmail.com. You will also find us on Facebook, Advanced TV Herstory, a podcast. Lastly, we are on Instagram at Advanced TV Herstory. And finally, if you're finally deciding that you want to subscribe to this podcast and make it part of your life, you can do so at any of the apps you might find on your phone, such as Apple Podcast, Google Podcast, Radio Public, Spotify, YouTube. They also have streaming, so if instead you subscribe and just want to press play, you can do so on your tablet, on your desktop, wherever you want. You will find this episode and all future and past of Advanced TV Herstory. Thanks so much for listening. I'm your host, Cynthia Bemis Abrams.